It's one of the hottest debates in the book writing community. Should you include a prologue or not? Many writers seem to be under the impression that if your book begins with a prologue and you submit it to literary agents, it will be dead on arrival because all agents universally hate prologues. Today, I want to address what I'm calling the Great Prologue Debate and give you my personal do's and don'ts for writing effective prologues. Hopefully, my tips help you determine if a prologue is effective for your particular story, and if it is, I hope to give you some practical tips and strategies for how to go about crafting and engaging one. If you are in the process of writing a book, I recommend subscribing to my channel. Every single week, I post a new video either with writing tips like this one or advice on the publishing industry, and I would love to have you around. First, I want to address the elephant in the room, which is, do literary agents really hate prologues? I've seen your comments, I've read your emails about this question, and I finally want to address it in a video. It's become a really passionate topic among querying writers because when you are reaching out to literary agents, in addition to your query letter, they ask for a sample of the first 10 pages of your manuscript. And if you have a prologue, of course, that prologue is going to be part of those 10 pages. So if you're in that boat, you may be anxious about your prologue, wondering if it's necessary at all, and just struggling to figure out how the prologue is going to be received. To be completely honest and transparent with you, when I worked in the publishing industry for top-tier literary agents and editors at publishing houses, there was no universal ban on prologues or anything like that. It really was a case-by-case basis. If the prologue was an effective entry point into the story, the agent and editor had no problem with it, and we published books that had prologues in them. On the other hand, if it isn't effective, or if it just doesn't really serve the end goal of the story, then yes, you're most likely going to want to omit it. But in the industry, there isn't this conception that all prologues are bad by any means. So I don't want you to feel that if your story really does need and justify a prologue, that you are out of luck. That's not the case. My opinion is that prologues can be really, really effective if they are well executed and strategically thought out. However, on the flip side, there are a lot of prologues that really aren't serving the story and are not well executed, and I think that's what gives prologues a bad reputation. However, it is possible to write a strong and engaging prologue, so I want you to stay optimistic if you are considering having one in your book. If you have been reaching out to literary agents and you have a prologue in those first 10 pages, and you're getting rejections or you're not getting the responses from them that you want to, it could be that the prologue is an issue, but I would also encourage you to think about some other issues that might be present in either your query letter, your synopsis, or in your pages that could be turning off literary agents. And I have a whole video that goes through some reasons why agents might be rejecting your submission, so I recommend checking that out if you're in that position. So now that we have settled that prologues are not universally bad, let's talk through some strategic do's and don'ts for how to write an effective one, as well as when they should be used and when they maybe shouldn't be used. My first tip is that you do want to consider if prologues are commonplace within your genre. Now, some genres do naturally lend themselves more to a prologue than others. In my opinion, the top two are thrillers, mystery, suspense, and historical fiction. In the case of thrillers, mysteries, or suspense, a prologue is often used to tease the main conflict or potentially the crime that occurs later in the story to hook the reader's interest in seeing how that pans out. So it is used as a tactic to establish suspense from the very beginning. And with historical fiction, oftentimes you are covering a wide amount of time, or maybe you're flashing from present day to a historical period back to present day, or between two historical periods, in which case a prologue can be used to provide background context or even flash forward to a later portion of the narrative that the reader will explore later on in the story. For instance, you might have a prologue with a character discovering a historical artifact or a newspaper clipping or a photograph that then brings them back into the historical period and kickstarts the historical narrative. Just because I am saying that prologues are more commonplace and standard in these two genres Doesn't mean that you cannot have a prologue in other genres. There are plenty of examples of effective prologues in other genres. However, when we're talking about the contemporary publishing market, I would say that those two genres are the most common for prologues. My first don't is don't let your prologue be too long. This is key with writing an effective prologue. My recommendation is to limit the prologue to no more than 2 to 5 double-spaced pages in your manuscript. I also recommend containing the prologue to one singular scene. That's because if the prologue goes on for too long, you run the risk of disengaging the reader and/or the literary agent. And if you have a shorter prologue, that also guarantees that within that first 10-page excerpt that you send to literary agents, you do get to the main narrative. It might be a bit difficult for a literary agent to evaluate your work. If the entire 10 pages is all prologue, they will want to see some of the main narrative at least. So keeping it short helps to ensure that. Also, a longer prologue just increases the likelihood that the reader or the literary agent is just going to skim through it, because remember, when the reader sees the label prologue, they know that this is an adjacent portion to the main narrative. They know that the actual story hasn't kickstarted yet, so naturally their attention is not going to be as laser focused as it will be in the very first official chapter. So you want to make sure that you keep it short and sweet so that you don't lose their interest. My next do is to make your prologue impressionistic. This is how you are going to get your reader to engage with and remember your prologue scene. With a prologue, you have the benefit of really not having to provide a ton of introductory material or backstory or context like you will in the main narrative. For instance, when you introduce a character in the prologue, you really don't have to necessarily explain who they are and how they know the other characters or get into any of the type of explanatory material that the reader will expect in the main narrative. That's because the reader will understand that we're going to get the context for the prologue later on in the story, and we're not going to expect it at this point. Your purpose with the prologue then really becomes simple and comes down to piquing the reader's interest and introducing a point of tension that then inspires them to continue on into the main narrative. So keep the prologue action-oriented and make sure you focus on a singular, consequential, and memorable moment. This is also going to help ensure that whenever we are deep into the main narrative, we will still remember what happened in that prologue scene because it will have made such a strong impression on us. And then when the time comes to contextualize the prologue and dissect its significance, we will immediately be able to remember it without having to go back and reread it. My next don't for writing a prologue is do not info dump. Now, I understand the temptation to use a prologue to provide a lot of background information about your characters and about the world that they inhabit. But believe me when I say the prologue is just not the place to do it. This can happen if you are writing sci-fi or fantasy where you've conjured a really complex world, perhaps with its own political history that you want to get into, or geographic history that you want to explain, or there's technological elements or fantastical elements that you feel the reader needs to know before entering the main narrative. However, you should not just use the prologue as a space to info dump, almost providing like a textbook type description of the novel's world and circumstances, because that is a guaranteed way to make the reader disengage and skim through the prologue section. Instead, all of those world building elements should be integrated organically within the main narrative. So I really encourage you to immediately kickstart the action of the plot and weave in those background details as they become relevant in the story. Do not use the prologue as a place to provide an expose on all of the nuances of your novel's world. Info dumping is really just a bad technique in your novel overall, no matter where it occurs, and it is especially risky to info dump right on the opening page of your novel, because that one is the most critical to hooking your reader's interest. So be really, really careful not to use the prologue to info dump. My last do for the prologue is you do want to differentiate your prologue from the main narrative in some way. Something that's really cool about the prologue is because it stands alone, separate from the main narrative, and it isn't labeled as its own chapter, the reader sets different expectations for the prologue, and therefore they will come to accept a prologue that is written in a different style or point of view from the rest of the narrative. So you can use the prologue to show a character's point of view that you never show in the main novel, or maybe you don't show until the very end. Or the prologue can adopt a different point of view than the rest of the narrative does. So perhaps the prologue is written in third person while the rest of the narrative is in first person. That's completely acceptable for a prologue because, again, it stands alone and the reader will not expect it to necessarily match the exact style of the rest of the narrative. So because of that, you can really be experimental and super creative with your prologue, and if that ultimately serves your story in some way to add that extra layer of complexity, I would encourage you to go forward with crafting an intriguing prologue. I want to read through an example of what I think is a really strong prologue from a contemporary novel so that you can see books are getting published with prologues, so they're absolutely not off limits if you want to be a traditionally published author. And two, I think this prologue perfectly encapsulates all of the do's and don'ts and strategic tips that I just went through. So with that, let's read through it. This is the prologue to the novel The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. It is a really popular work of psychological suspense, one of the top bestsellers in the genre from the past years. So here's how the prologue goes. Alicia Berenson's diary, 14th July. I don't know why I'm writing this. That's not true. Maybe I do know, and just don't want to admit it to myself. I don't even know what to call it, this thing I'm writing. It feels a little pretentious to call it a diary. It's not like I have anything to say. Anne Frank kept a diary, or Samuel Pepys, not someone like me. Calling it a journal sounds too academic somehow, as if I should write in it every day, and I don't want to. If it becomes a chore, I'll never keep it up. Maybe I'll call it nothing, an unnamed something that I occasionally write in. I like that better. Once you name something, it stops you seeing all of it or why it matters. You focus on the word, which is just the tiniest part really, the tip of an iceberg. I've never been that comfortable with words. I always think in pictures, express myself with images, so I'd never have started writing this if it weren't for Gabriel. I've been feeling depressed lately about a few things. I thought I was doing a good job of hiding it, but he noticed. Of course he did. He notices everything. He asked how the painting was going. I said it wasn't. He got me a glass of wine, and I sat at the kitchen table while he cooked. I like watching Gabriel move around the kitchen. He's a graceful cook, elegant, balletic, organized. Unlike me, I just make a mess. Talk to me, he said. There's nothing to say. I just get so stuck in my head sometimes. I feel like I'm wading through mud. Why don't you try writing things down? Keeping some kind of record, that might help. Yes, I suppose so. I'll try it. Don't just say it, darling. Do it. I will. He kept nagging me, but I did nothing about it. And then a few days later, he presented me with this little book to write in. It has a black leather cover and thick white blank pages. I ran my hand across the first page, feeling its smoothness, then sharpened my pencil and began. And he was right, of course. I feel better already. Writing this down is providing a kind of release, an outlet, a space to express myself, a bit like therapy, I suppose. Gabriel didn't say it, but I could tell he's concerned about me. And if I'm going to be honest, and I might as well be, the real reason I agreed to keep this diary was to reassure him, prove that I'm okay. I can't bear the thought of him worrying about me. I don't ever want to cause him any distress or make him unhappy or cause him pain. I love Gabriel so much. He is without a doubt the love of my life. I love him so totally, completely. Sometimes it threatens to overwhelm me. Sometimes I think, no, I won't write about that. This is going to be a joyful record of ideas and images that inspire me artistically, things that make a creative impact on me. I'm only going to write positive, happy, normal thoughts. No crazy thoughts allowed. So there's a few reasons why I think this prologue works really well. Number one, it does take that experimental creative approach because if you've read the novel, you'll know that Alicia's point of view is not one that we see in the novel. We actually have another narrator who is driving the plot forward. So this immediately establishes intrigue because we're curious about her character and we're hearing her voice when we actually don't hear her voice when we enter the main narrative. And secondly, it does establish a little bit of suspense because there's clearly something that the narrator is reckoning with in writing her journal, and ending the prologue with this ominous thought, no crazy thoughts allowed, immediately tells the reader that something is off with her, and then we're invested to figure out why this diary was given to her, and what exactly she's trying to work out through writing in the diary. I hope these tips and this example really helps you understand what goes into a good prologue, when they're effective and when they aren't as effective. Let me know in the comments if your novel has a prologue or not, or if you have any other questions or thoughts on prologue writing, because I know it is a highly debated topic. If you're interested in some more tips on how to craft the most effective opening to your novel, I recommend checking out my video on strategies to help nail your opening pages, where I go through some tips to help you do just that. And as always, if you found this video helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. It helps me know I'm bringing you content that is interesting and helpful and allows me to grow this community. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.